The dust swirled around the wooden platform of Clearwater Station like a devil's dance, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and broken dreams. Margaret Whitmore clutched her leather satchel tighter against her chest, her wedding dress now stained with tears and the grime of 3 days' travel. The train's whistle echoed through the valley, a mournful sound that seemed to mirror the ache in her heart. She had come all this way from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, only to find his grave marker instead of his welcoming arms. The telegram had been brief and brutal. Thomas Hartwell, her intended, had been shot down by claim jumpers just 2 weeks before her arrival. The preacher who delivered the news spoke in hushed tones about how Thomas had mentioned her often, how he'd prepared a small cabin on his homestead with such care, painting the shutters blue because he'd heard she favored that color. Now she stood alone on a platform in the middle of nowhere, with barely enough money for a return ticket and a heart full of shattered expectations. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Clearwater. Population maybe 200 souls on a good day. Wooden buildings lined a single dusty street, their paint peeling and their signs creaking in the constant wind. The saloon's batwing doors swung lazily, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano playing a melancholy tune. A few curious townspeople had gathered to watch the unusual sight of a woman in a wedding dress weeping at the train station, but they kept their distance, unsure of how to approach such raw grief. Margaret wiped her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had belonged to her mother, trying to compose herself enough to purchase her ticket back east. She'd have to wire her sister in Boston, confess her failure, and return to the suffocating life of spinsterhood she'd tried so desperately to escape. At 28, she'd already been considered past her prime by Boston society, and this Western adventure had been her last hope for something different, something meaningful. As she approached the ticket window, a small hand tugged at her skirt. She looked down to see a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with tangled auburn hair and eyes the color of summer grass. The child's dress was patched and worn, but clean, and she stared up at Margaret with an intensity that was both unsettling and somehow comforting. "Don't leave," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I need you." Margaret knelt down to the child's level, her own troubles momentarily forgotten. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lucy," the girl replied, her small fingers reaching out to touch the pearl buttons on Margaret's wedding dress. "You're the prettiest lady I ever seen. Are you an angel?" A bitter laugh escaped Margaret's lips. "Far from it, I'm afraid. I'm just a foolish woman who came here to marry a dead man." Lucy's eyes widened with understanding beyond her years. "You came to marry Mr. Thomas? He was real nice to me. He used to give me peppermint sticks when Pa brought me to town. Said he was going to have a wife soon who'd probably like little girls." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Thomas had thought of children, had imagined a family. She struggled to maintain her composure as Lucy continued speaking. "My ma died last winter of the fever," Lucy said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Pa tries real hard, but he don't know much about girl things. I ain't had nobody to brush my hair proper in months." Margaret's heart clenched. She reached out instinctively to smooth the child's tangled locks. "Where is your father?" Lucy pointed toward the general store across the street. "He's trying to sell our last horse so we can buy supplies. Says we might have to go back east to my aunt's house, but I don't want to. This is home." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Here was a child desperate to stay in this harsh frontier town, while she herself was desperate to leave it. She studied Lucy's face, seeing something of herself in those determined green eyes. Perhaps it was the loneliness, or maybe the recognition of another soul adrift in an unforgiving world, but Margaret felt a stirring of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. "Lucy, would you like me to braid your hair? I used to do it for my little sister back home." The child's face lit up like a sunrise. "Oh yes, please." Margaret set down her satchel and began working her fingers through Lucy's auburn tangles, gentle and patient, despite the knots. As she worked, Lucy chattered about life in Clearwater, about the wildflowers that bloomed in spring, about the creek where she liked to catch tadpoles, about the way the mountains turned purple at sunset. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since arriving, Margaret began to see the town through different eyes. "My pa says this land's got potential," Lucy said as Margaret wove her hair into neat plaits. "Says if we can just hold on another year or two, things'll get better. But I think he's real scared since Ma died. He don't smile much anymore." Margaret tied off the braids with ribbons from her own hair. "There, beautiful." Lucy touched her new hairstyle with wonder. "Really? Really? Now tell me about your father. What's his name?" "Daniel Murphy. He's got the claim next to where Mr. Thomas lived. Pa's been trying to work both places since Mr. Thomas got shot, trying to keep the claim jumpers from taking the land, but it's too much for one man." A plan began forming in Margaret's mind, crazy and impractical, but somehow feeling more right than anything she'd contemplated in years. "Lucy, do you think your father might need some help? I mean, I know I'm just a city woman, but I can cook and clean and I'm not afraid of hard work." Lucy's eyes grew wide. "You mean you'd stay? You wouldn't go back on the train?" "I don't know yet. I'd need to meet your father first, and he'd need to agree. It wouldn't be proper otherwise." "Oh, he'd agree." Lucy grabbed Margaret's hand and began pulling her toward the general store. "Pa always says the good Lord provides in mysterious ways. Maybe you're what he provided." Margaret allowed herself to be led across the dusty street, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a banner of surrender to one dream and acceptance of another. The general store was dimly lit and smelled of leather, tobacco, and coffee beans. A tall man with broad shoulders and work-worn hands stood at the counter, his hat in his hands as he spoke in low tones with the shopkeeper. "Pa!" Lucy called out, "Pa, come meet the angel lady." Daniel Murphy turned, and Margaret found herself looking into eyes the same green as his daughter's, but shadowed with a weariness that spoke of recent losses and heavy burdens. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent his life working under the western sun. He was perhaps 35, still young but carrying himself with the weight of responsibility. "Lucy, what have I told you about bothering strangers?" he said gently, but his eyes never left Margaret's face. There was curiosity there, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "She ain't a stranger, Pa. She came to marry Mr. Thomas, but he's dead, and now she's going to help us instead." Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Lucy, you can't just decide things like that." He looked at Margaret apologetically. "I'm sorry, miss. My daughter has a powerful imagination." Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Actually, Mr. Murphy, Lucy might not be entirely wrong. I'm Margaret Whitmore, and I did come here to marry Thomas Hartwell. Finding him dead has left me in something of a predicament. Lucy tells me you might need help with your homestead." Daniel studied her for a long moment, taking in her wedding dress, her obviously Eastern manners, her soft hands that had never known hard labor. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate the offer, but homesteading ain't like running a household back east. It's brutal work and dangerous. Just last month we had trouble with those same claim jumpers who killed Thomas. A woman like you, a woman like me, what?" Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "A woman like me survived the death of both parents before I was 21. Managed a household budget on a seamstress's wages, and traveled alone across half the country to start a new life. I may not know much about farming or frontier living, but I'm not helpless." Something shifted in Daniel's expression. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with knowing eyes, cleared his throat. "Dan, you've been trying to work 2 claims by yourself while caring for that little girl. You're going to work yourself to death if you keep on like that. Might be the Lord's way of providing help." "But it wouldn't be proper," Daniel protested. "A single woman living on my homestead, people would talk." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed on. "Then perhaps we should make it proper." The words hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Daniel's eyes widened, and even Lucy seemed to sense the weight of what had just been suggested. "Miss Whitmore," Daniel said carefully, "you don't know me. I could be a drunkard or a wife-beater or worse. You can't possibly be suggesting—" "I'm suggesting a marriage of convenience, Mr. Murphy. I need a home and a purpose. You need help with your homestead and someone to care for Lucy. We could make a practical arrangement." Lucy clapped her hands together, like in the fairy tales. "Oh, say yes, Pa." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the decision. "Miss Whitmore, my Sarah, my wife, she died giving birth to a son we lost as well. I ain't sure I'm ready for— that is, I don't know if I can—" Margaret's voice softened with understanding. "Mr. Murphy, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to let me help. We could start as partners, nothing more. If in time something deeper develops, well, that would be a blessing. If not, we'd still be helping each other survive." The shopkeeper nodded approvingly. "Makes sense to me. Plenty of marriages out here started with less." Daniel looked down at his daughter, who was staring up at him with such hope it nearly broke his heart. He thought of the long nights he'd lain awake, worrying about her future, about what would happen if something happened to him, about how she needed a woman's influence in her life. He thought of Thomas Hartwell, who'd been a good friend and would have wanted his intended bride to be cared for. He thought of the 2 homesteads that were slowly wearing him down, and the claim jumpers who were getting bolder every week. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "if we were to do this thing, you'd need to understand what you're getting into. The cabin's small and rough. We'd be lucky to make ends meet even in a good year. There's danger from desperados and hostile Indians. The winters are brutal, and the summers ain't much better. You'd be trading whatever comfortable life you had back east for something that might kill you." Margaret looked out the store window at the harsh landscape, at the dust devils dancing in the street, at the mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. For the first time in her life, she felt the stirring of real adventure, real purpose. This wasn't the romantic dream she'd originally pursued, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a chance to build something meaningful with her own hands. "Mr. Murphy," she said, "I came here to marry a stranger and make a new life. The stranger may be different than I expected, but the goal remains the same." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, weighing possibilities and risks. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The preacher's name is William Crawford. He lives above the church at the end of the street. If you're certain about this, Miss Whitmore, we could speak to him today." Lucy let out a whoop of joy that could probably be heard 3 counties over. "Can I be in the wedding? Can I wear flowers in my hair?" Margaret knelt down and took the little girl's hands in hers. "Lucy, I want you to understand something. This is going to be different from fairy tale weddings. Your father and I are going to be partners first, friends, hopefully. I'm not trying to replace your mother, but I'd be honored to be your friend and help take care of you." Lucy's face grew solemn. "I know you ain't my real ma, but maybe you could be my heart ma." The simple phrase nearly undid Margaret completely. She pulled the child into a fierce hug, feeling for the first time since arriving in Clearwater that she might actually belong somewhere. An hour later, Margaret stood once again in her wedding dress, but this time in the small wooden church instead of at the train station. Daniel had cleaned up and put on his only good shirt, and Lucy had insisted on weaving wildflowers into her newly braided hair. The ceremony was simple and brief, witnessed by the shopkeeper, his wife, and a handful of curious townspeople who'd heard about the unusual turn of events. Preacher Crawford spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the challenges of frontier life. He looked directly at both Margaret and Daniel as he talked about partnership and mutual support, clearly understanding the nature of their arrangement. When he asked if they promised to care for each other in sickness and health, for better or worse, both answered with quiet conviction. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and respectful, more a handshake between partners than a romantic gesture. But as their lips touched, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected. Not passion, perhaps, but possibility. This man had kind eyes and gentle hands, and he loved his daughter with a fierce devotion that spoke well of his character. As they walked out of the church into the golden light of late afternoon, Lucy, skipping between them and chattering excitedly about their new life together, Margaret caught sight of the train depot in the distance. The evening train would be arriving soon, the one that would have carried her back to Boston and a life of quiet desperation. Instead, she was walking toward a small cabin with a man she'd known for 3 hours and a little girl who'd already claimed a piece of her heart. The Murphy homestead sat in a valley between rolling hills, with a creek running along one side and Thomas Hartwell's abandoned claim stretching along the other. The cabin was indeed small and rough, but it was sturdy and clean. Daniel had clearly done his best to maintain it, even while struggling with the overwhelming work of 2 properties. There was a small garden plot, a chicken coop, a barn that had seen better days, and fields that showed the promise of good soil if properly tended. "It ain't much," Daniel said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's honest land." Margaret looked around at the vast sky, the rolling grasslands, the distant mountains painted purple by the setting sun. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. That first night, Daniel made himself a bed in the barn while Margaret and Lucy shared the cabin's single bedroom. As she lay listening to the child's steady breathing and the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier night, Margaret thought about the strange turns her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she'd been a spinster heading west to marry a stranger. Now she was a married woman with a daughter, facing challenges she couldn't even imagine. Lucy stirred beside her and whispered, "Margaret, are you really going to stay?" "I'm really going to stay. Forever." Margaret thought about the promise she'd made, about the work that lay ahead, about the man sleeping in the barn who'd married her out of necessity rather than love. "Forever," she whispered back. The next morning brought their first real test. Margaret had never milked a cow, gathered eggs from potentially hostile chickens, or cooked over a wood-burning stove. Her first attempts at frontier housework were disasters that would have been comical if they weren't so frustrating. She burned the biscuits, let the cow kick over the milk pail, and somehow managed to set a dish towel on fire. Daniel, to his credit, never lost patience with her failures. Instead, he quietly cleaned up her mistakes and showed her again how to do things properly. Lucy proved to be an excellent teacher as well, patiently demonstrating how to collect eggs without startling the hens, and how to feed the chickens so they wouldn't peck at her hands. "Ma used to say that learning ain't about not making mistakes," Lucy said wisely as Margaret attempted her 5th batch of biscuits. "It's about making different mistakes each time until you run out of mistakes to make." By the end of the first week, Margaret had achieved something resembling competence in the basic tasks of frontier life. Her hands were blistered and her back ached constantly, but she felt a satisfaction she'd never known in her previous life. Every successfully milked cow, every edible meal, every small improvement to their daily routine felt like a victory. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, trying to maintain both homesteads while keeping watch for claim jumpers. He was quiet by nature, but Margaret began to notice the small kindnesses he showed, how he always made sure she had enough firewood chopped, how he repaired things around the cabin without being asked, how he never complained about her cooking, even when it was barely edible. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset, Lucy asleep against Margaret's shoulder, Daniel spoke quietly about his fears for the future. "Those claim jumpers ain't gonna give up easy. They want this land, and Thomas's death just encouraged them. I don't know if one man can hold both properties against them." Margaret adjusted Lucy's weight against her shoulder and considered her words carefully. "Then perhaps it's time to stop thinking like one man holding 2 properties and start thinking like a family holding one very large homestead." Daniel looked at her questioningly. You've been trying to maintain Thomas's claim as a separate entity, Margaret continued. But legally, as his intended bride, don't I have some claim to that land? And as your wife, doesn't that make it part of our family holding? A slow smile spread across Daniel's weathered face. You know, you might just be right about that. We'd need to check with the land office, but if we could consolidate the claims, we'd have one of the largest homesteads in the territory, Margaret finished. Large enough to be profitable, defensible enough to discourage claim jumpers. You've got a good head for this kind of thinking, Daniel said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. That night, as Margaret lay beside the sleeping Lucy, she heard Daniel moving around outside, checking the animals and securing the property as he did every night. But tonight, his step seemed lighter, more hopeful. Perhaps their strange marriage of convenience might actually work. The claim jumpers came 3 weeks later, just after dawn, on a crisp October morning. Margaret was hanging laundry when she spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Daniel was already reaching for his rifle, his face grim with determination. "Take Lucy and get in the root cellar," he ordered. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." But Margaret had grown up reading stories of frontier women who stood beside their men, and 3 weeks of hard living had awakened something fierce in her spirit. "Lucy, go to the cellar and stay there. Daniel, I can reload faster than you can shoot. We face this together." Daniel started to protest, but the riders were already approaching, and there wasn't time to argue. 6 men on horseback, armed and looking like trouble. Their leader was a thin man, with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Murphy!" he called out. "Time to be reasonable. This land's too much for one man to handle. We're prepared to make you a fair offer." "Same answer as before, Briggs," Daniel called back, his rifle trained on the leader. "This is legally claimed land, and you're trespassing." Briggs's smile widened. "See, that's where you're wrong. Thomas Hartwell's claim died with him, and you can't work 2 homesteads legal-like. Land office is going to declare it abandoned soon enough." Margaret stepped out from behind the cabin wall, and several of the riders' eyes widened at the sight of a woman in this confrontation. "Actually, gentlemen, Thomas Hartwell's claim passed to his intended bride upon his death. That would be me, and as Daniel Murphy's wife, our claims are now consolidated into one legal homestead." Briggs's confident expression faltered slightly. "You're bluffing." Margaret held up an official-looking document, legal papers from the Territorial Land Office filed just yesterday. "This entire valley is now the Murphy family homestead, all legal and proper." The truth was, she was indeed bluffing. The papers were real, but they wouldn't be processed for another week. But her confident demeanor and the official seal on the documents were enough to plant doubt in the claim jumpers' minds. Briggs studied the document from a distance, clearly trying to determine if it was genuine. Finally, he spat in the dust. "This ain't over, Murphy. Legal papers or not, this land's gonna be ours." "Then you'll be taking it from a family, not just one man," Margaret replied steadily. "And we have friends in town who know exactly who you are and what you're trying to do." The claim jumpers rode away, but everyone knew it was a temporary reprieve. As soon as Briggs could verify the status of their claim, he'd be back with a different approach. That evening, Daniel looked at Margaret with new respect. "Where did you learn to face down armed men like that?" Margaret smiled as she served dinner to her unusual family. "I spent 10 years dealing with bill collectors in Boston. Armed desperados aren't really that different," Lucy giggled. "Margaret's brave as a lion, ain't she, Pa?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That she is, little one. That she is." As autumn turned to winter, the Murphy family settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Margaret's housekeeping skills improved dramatically, though she never quite mastered Daniel's mother's biscuit recipe. Lucy thrived under Margaret's attention, learning to read better and developing the manners of a proper young lady while retaining her frontier independence. Daniel began including Margaret in decisions about the homestead, valuing her practical intelligence and different perspective. She suggested improvements he'd never considered, A better layout for the garden, a more efficient arrangement of the chicken coop, ways to preserve food that would see them through the harsh winter months. The first blizzard hit in early December, trapping them in the cabin for 3 days. It was then that Margaret truly understood what frontier isolation meant. The snow piled higher than the windows, the wind howled like a living thing, and the cold was so intense that water froze solid just feet from the fire. But instead of feeling imprisoned, Margaret found herself appreciating the forced intimacy. They told stories, played simple games, and Lucy taught her frontier children's songs. Daniel proved to have a beautiful voice and knew ballads from his childhood in Ireland. Margaret shared tales of city life that seemed as exotic to her listeners as their frontier existence had once seemed to her. On the third night, with Lucy finally asleep between them and the fire crackling softly, Daniel spoke quietly about his first wife. "Sarah was born to this life," he said. "She could birth a calf, preserve enough food for winter, and defend the homestead all in the same day. Sometimes I feel like I'm asking you to live up to something impossible." Margaret considered her words carefully. "Daniel, I can't be Sarah, and I'm not trying to be, but I can be Margaret, and maybe that's enough." Daniel looked at her across their sleeping daughter, and for the first time since their marriage, Margaret saw something more than mere partnership in his eyes. "Maybe it is," he said softly. Christmas came with a break in the weather and a surprise visit from Preacher Crawford and several families from town. They brought gifts, warm clothes for Lucy, preserves and smoked meat for the winter, and news from the outside world. Margaret contributed her first successful batch of gingerbread, and the evening turned into an impromptu celebration. As she watched Daniel laughing with the other men and Lucy showing off her new doll to the other children, Margaret realized she'd found something she'd never even known she was looking for. Not just a home, but a community. These people had accepted her not because of who she'd been in Boston, but because of who she was becoming here in Clearwater. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and renewed challenges. The claim jumpers returned with a new strategy. Instead of direct confrontation, they began targeting the homestead's resources. Fences were cut, livestock went missing, and someone poisoned their well. But the Murphy family was no longer facing these threats alone. The community that had welcomed them at Christmas rallied around them. Neighboring homesteaders took turns keeping watch, townspeople provided supplies, and even the territorial marshal made several pointed visits to the area. Margaret had become more than just Daniel's wife. She'd become the unofficial leader of a women's network that stretched across 3 counties. Her combination of Eastern education and frontier practicality made her a natural organizer. She coordinated everything from shared childcare to community defense strategies. One warm May evening, as they sat on their expanded porch, watching Lucy chase fireflies in the meadow, Daniel reached over and took Margaret's work-worn hand in his. "I need to tell you something," he said. Margaret felt her heart skip, unsure whether to hope or worry. "When we married, it was for practical reasons. I want you to know that's changed, at least for me. Somewhere along the way, this became real." Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "For me too." With their second kiss, there in the gathering twilight with their daughter's laughter echoing across the valley, was everything their first had not been. It was a promise, a beginning, and a celebration of all they'd built together. Lucy came running up to the porch, breathless and glowing. "Did you see how many fireflies there are? It's like the whole meadow's full of stars." Margaret pulled the little girl onto her lap, wrapping her arms around the child, who'd become her heart-daughter in truth as well as affection. "Just like stars, sweetheart. Each one a little light in the darkness." 2 years later, Margaret stood once again on the platform of Clearwater Station, but this time she wasn't weeping. She was there to meet the train, bringing Daniel's brother and his family from Ireland, emigrants who'd heard about the opportunities in their growing community. The homestead now sprawled across the entire valley, prosperous enough to support multiple families. Lucy, now 10 and every inch a confident frontier girl, bounced excitedly beside her. "Do you think Uncle Patrick's children will like it here, Margaret?" Margaret smiled, her hand resting on her swollen belly where Daniel's second child grew. "I think they'll love it, just like we do." The train whistle echoed across the valley, no longer mournful, but welcoming. Margaret thought about that desperate woman in a wedding dress who'd stood on this same platform 3 years ago, broken-hearted and lost. That woman had been seeking a fairy tale ending, but had found something better. A real life, built by her own hands and filled with genuine love. Daniel appeared at her side, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of a marriage that had grown from necessity into deep partnership. "Ready to welcome the new arrivals?" "Ready," Margaret replied, thinking about all the ways that word had changed meaning in her life. As the train pulled into the station, she whispered a small prayer of gratitude for the little girl who tugged at her skirt and changed everything with 4 simple words. "Don't leave, I need you." Sometimes the most important journeys begin not with grand plans or romantic dreams, but with the simple decision to stay and see what might be possible. The Clearwater Valley had taught her that home isn't a place you find, but a place you build, one day and one choice at a time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the life you end up with turns out to be far better than the one you originally planned. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, love, and survival on the frontier. And tell us in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment when a child's words completely changed your life's direction? What would you have done in Margaret's situation? Taken that train back east or stayed to build a new life in Clearwater? Share your thoughts and let us know what other Old West stories you'd like to hear.